Hello class, and welcome to your second module on social constructions of target populations. In this short video, we're going to go over the Nicholson-Crotty and Meier article. So, let's get started. Okay, so this week's readings built on Schneider and Ingram's theory by placing certain conditions on it. Now, what does this mean? Well, when we're doing political science research or public policy research, when we put conditions on a theory, essentially what we're describing is we're specifying specific circumstances that can make the story of the theory more or less plausible, more or less likely. We can think about conditional probabilities, right? So what's a conditional probability? Well, let's think about my probability of contracting COVID, right? So let's say that there's like a baseline probability of that. But if we put a conditional probability on top of it, say, my probability of contracting COVID, conditional on me following all the precautions instituted by the university, there's that probability, which is relatively low, versus the conditional probability of me contracting COVID if I ignore these recommendations and go to a big party outside of the bubble, right? Now, with these conditional probabilities, we have one likelihood that's very high of contracting COVID and another likelihood that's very relatively low of contracting COVID. So this is what conditions do. They sort of specify different groups for our, situations that can shape the likelihood that this causal story does or does not play out. So, with Schneider and Ingram, they, with Nicholson-Crotty and Meier, place three conditions on this whole story for Schneider and Ingram and social constructions of target populations, playing out to the fullest extent where these social constructions actually impact policy created by policymakers. So let's go through those conditions as they introduce them.
Okay, here we go with some slides. So we're getting into the Nicholson-Crotty and Meier reading, which was originally published in 2005. Now, just to reiterate, when we're thinking about how to apply conditions to theories, we are essentially looking to make descriptions that use this language, the conditions under which, right? For instance, the papers that we read for Tuesday's class explored the conditions under which social constructions of target populations are likely to shape public policy, or the conditions under which deviant populations, as defined by Schneider and Ingram, are likely to receive policy benefits, which, would be unusual. And Nicholson-Crotty and Meier outlined three main conditions which, when present, they believe shape the transition between a public consensus that a group is socially deviant and the ultimate enactment of a public policy targeting that group, right? Now, what are these? Well, there are three, as we said. The first is a value-laden stereotype, or in other words, the deviant social construction, again, as defined by Schneider and Ingram. And this is the subgroup they're focusing on for this article. The second, however, is the presence and action of a moral entrepreneur. And then the third is the understanding by policymakers of the sufficient political profit that exists in targeting this group with a policy. This is a condition that they also refer to as the political entrepreneur, who may or may not be the same person as the moral entrepreneur. So let's go through these one at a time. Now, yes, the quote-unquote deviant group needs to have a negative social construction or a value-laden negative stereotype. But it's more than that, because as the authors describe, sometimes, quote, deviant social constructions become widely accepted by popular opinion, but no policy change occurs. So again, what are some of the key factors or conditions here? Well, the authors suggest that bias against the group must in some way assert or be tied to the idea that accepted social norms or conventions about what is and is not appropriate behavior in American society cannot contain the group, that the group cannot be controlled without public policy action. And this relates to the second key element, which is that if left uncontrolled, this group is a potential threat. A threat to the status quo, but more than that, a threat to the quote-unquote mainstream, non-marginalized, comfortable group in power. a kind of messaging that underlines how this group is coming for your comfortable and safe way of life, that this group is threatening. We can think about this condition in terms of proximity and problem definition. How shaping public discourse around a deviant group's potential threat increases the proximity of the social problem, such as that for mainstream, more privileged or advantaged groups, this issue, whatever it is, ends up becoming much closer to home. Now, in order for this condition to really take hold, the authors argue that there needs to be a moral entrepreneur. Now, this moral entrepreneur can do the work of making this relativity real, right? Making this relationship between the deviant group and the advantaged group or the mainstream group real. They can create the fear or the threat to the advantaged majority's cultural, moral, or even physical or economic security. The quotation by Conrad and Schneider aptly summarizes that constructions of deviance are inevitably closely linked to the dominant social control institutions in society, and a moral entrepreneur can make that link plain to the masses. In other words, they can reflect the values of the popular norm, existing as a kind of hero for the mainstream. They can then credibly and convincingly translate this threat to the public in messaging, shaping a kind of movement of public opinion. And then finally, they need to make sure that they create ownership of the problem, right? This is again back to problem definition. They need to own this narrative and ensure that their story, their message or social construction is the dominant one. It's the image that the public thinks of first, right? The image they believe above all others related to that group. And this is kind of what we see definitely in the case study with the Chinese immigrants back from the turn of the 20th century. Now, but even with that in hand, right, there's one more condition. It still might not be enough to provoke policy change, right? Because for public policy to change, policymakers need to take potentially costly action. Now, policymakers and elected officials are presumed by theorists to be in constant consideration of costs and benefits. This is because their time is very valuable, and that is true. They have many demands on their time. It is costly. And they can only do so much in representing their constituents. They can only get engaged on so many policies. They can only go on record in support of some things. They can only research so many issues. But they have to do as much as they can because they want to be reelected. They need to be taking action that is most electorally advantageous. Now, some folks might consider this to be, in the most cynical of ways. They can look at it as very self-serving or potentially deceptive. At the other hand, at its foundation, it is essentially a mechanism driving American democracy, right? That the people hold their elected officials accountable. The people are the ultimate boss, and so elected officials need to do their best to work for us in order to keep their jobs. Now, it doesn't always work that way in practice to make sure that public good ends up happening. We have a lot of collective action problems, but that is a whole nother lecture. For now, we just need to understand that political entrepreneurs in office need to tie the policy action targeting the stereotype group to sufficient electoral benefits, right? Other elected officials need to be convinced that there is a payoff in taking this action, or they need to be convinced that if they don't take the action, it could cost them big time. And by the way, a political entrepreneur like Representative Lundgren from the reading needs to spend a great deal of costly time doing this job, right? So even finding a political entrepreneur that will take on this initiative, right, and spearhead this action, collective action and coordination from the rest of the legislative body, that's a tall order to begin with.
Understanding how different conditions impact the likelihood that these kinds of dynamics, like social constructions of target populations, are going to play an important role in policymaking is key. And while the next reading on Reif and Barth is a little bit less explicit, they do also introduce a lot of very important conditions on the likelihood that social constructions are going to be impactful or not impactful, depending on the presence of different dynamics, different individuals, or different justifications. And that one's key. But we're going to talk about that in class, and it's going to be on the module page. Before that, we have a video about empirical analysis, regression analysis. And I think this is going to be a really good, important, take a step back, make sure we understand this before we go forward. So make sure to watch that video. It's a little bit more of me talking and a lot less, in fact, no slides. So enjoy, and can't wait to see you on Tuesday.